Hello, welcome back to another episode. I'm Sam. Thanks for joining me. Been a bit quiet on the channel, but been recording some content, so I want to start feeding that out and been writing some stuff as well on the blog. So feel free to check that out at samtoohey.xyz. But I want to get into today's topic, and it's sort of a walkthrough on a topic that's fairly near and dear and close to me in terms of what I do on my day job. So Headless WordPress, and arguably this is a bit of a high level run through, but this should realistically be the last walkthrough you would ever need in order to look at considering Headless WordPress. And this is a consideration for current WordPress developers as well as JavaScript devs looking for a reliable, viable CMS as well too. So let's get started. So first and foremost, we're going to look over what the difference is between a traditional WordPress environment looks like and a headless WordPress environment. So with traditional WordPress, you have the common sort of structure as a single server. You have PHP doing a lot of the heavy lifting, a database, the web browser, sending and receiving requests, and your web server. And you're looking at LAMP or LAMP, depending on what you want to implement technology-wise. It's transportable, runs on a variety of systems from Docker to bare metal, virtualized, doesn't really matter. You can run WordPress on pretty much any sort of stack, regardless of LAMP, WAMP, anything like that. It is single server, like I said, so everything is encased in one solution. So when you purchase a WordPress solution from a hosting provider, you will have a single server. Arguably, there are shared and isolated solutions, but you will still be isolated in a single tenant virtual environment. PHP, again, is the classic block theme sort of structure. So in current modern development parlance, you're looking at block themes, which are arguably React and PHP based with plugins and the like. And you can look at some previous videos on the channel for more information on that. But it does based around building themes and using PHP-based WordPress themes to be able to render your content and create your content. And lastly, a little footnote as well, like I said, React 18 has been introduced into the modern sort of WordPress development via the full site editor and certain block creation as well and plugins. So there is an inkling towards moving towards these technologies and languages that are more universal outside of WordPress for the web. Not that you couldn't use JavaScript before, but using React and actual frameworks and libraries outside of just normal JavaScript is becoming more and more and more sort of commonplace in WordPress as that adoption grows. Whereas headless is a little bit different. So we look at this sort of model. If you look at from here, our request is sent to our front server. So your front end will be running Node.js in this case, and it's depending on your provider, it should realistically be framework agnostic. So if you're looking at using React or Next.js, Angular, Vue, Astro, anything of those with a .js essentially at the end, you can use a headless front end. As long as you can do fetch or just query data through Node.js to a backend, you can do headless WordPress. So your request is then rendered by this front-end server, be a static site generated front-end or a server-side render, it doesn't matter. You'll still have some front-end of which a user will see. And then you can do multiple things from here. You can query WordPress via an API, so via the REST API built into WordPress, or WP GraphQL, which gives you a GraphQL endpoint, which is pretty cool. You can query external databases or external services of data too and render that content as well. You can all do this all at once as well, or you can push data to other services too. So a miscellaneous sort of, a container or a phone device or anything else like that, you can actually send data to. So it's really push and pull. It's very flexible, very scalable, and quite performant when implemented correctly. So what is a headless CMS? WordPress originally wasn't conceived to be used as a headless CMS. WordPress was originally conceived to be a blogging system and has grown over the years into a monolithic tool that can be used for a variety of reasons, from LearnDash for an LMS, all the way through to BuddyBoss, to e-commerce with WooCommerce, to an implementation as well with Shopify too. There's plugins to embed Shopify stores in WordPress front ends too, if you want to do that. It is really flexible, very static to very dynamic. It can really be a powerful system if you use it correctly. It can also be very bloated as well too, and can get quite heavy. And for a long time, WordPress had a bit of a reputation for being quite slow, and it was more down to PHP in terms of its performance and its iterations over the years, but as well as the layout plugins that people would use and bundle in to make sites work different or work faster without the need of a developer. And that would end up causing issues and give a bit of a negative reputation around WordPress. But to this day, WordPress has 48% of the internet under its helm, and it isn't going anywhere. It is a fantastic tool, and I use it every day, and very proud to say that I am part of a community of people that is amazing, and I would recommend WordPress to anyone. But if we're looking at a headless CMS, there's a couple of things that WordPress does tick on this box as well that sort of relates to other headless CMSs like Sanity and Contentful. So realistically, on the tin, a headless CMS is a backend only content system. It will just store data of whatever type, and it will just retain that information. It is only queryable via an API. It has no system to render that content on its own. So for example, if you want to render HubSpot's contact information or a contact form from HubSpot and do it on a website, you have to embed that form. If you want to render data from a custom post type, say for creating a calendar or a gallery with advanced custom fields, you then need to query that field type and query the data and render it somehow. WordPress on its own can't query that unless you use a theme. In this case, we can't render or work with this data unless we implement it, and we implement that specifically via using the front end. So React components, or you can use Angular or Vue, it doesn't really matter. I'm a React engineer, so it's what I've been using for God knows how long. That's what I use, and that's what's used in this example as well. But as long as you can query, build, and structure your content in a certain way from that backend, that's how you would work with it. So think of it like fancy Lego, essentially. You choose your own front end. So you will be choosing whatever system you use to be able to interact with this data in whatever way you wish. Traditionally, it's via Fetch or Axios, but essentially, as long as you can query data from the origin where the data is being held in the backend solution, so your CMS in this case, you can work with it. And predominantly, it is done via REST API. But there are other providers out there that can use GraphQL to achieve this, like Contentful, as well as Shopify too. They have a project called Hydrogen and Oxygen, which is a framework and backend system to work with their ecom network. So you can use GraphQL specifically to query your store and create a headless front end for your online store. And WordPress has sort of grown in that adoption to be able to achieve similar sort of strides in that area with Headless WordPress as well, which is fairly impressive the last few years. How Headless WordPress works. So Headless WordPress specifically, its growth has been pretty slow in the last sort of 4 or 5 years and has really picked up a lot of steam around 2022 in terms of adoption and popularity. It was sort of niche for a long time. And now the mix, I guess I personally would like to thank a lot of the development with the full site editor and block themes and plugins and implementation of that sort of React, like I mentioned before, that cross-skilling ability into modern WordPress development, where considering other ways to expand on that sort of skill set development and build a headless site is more of a viable solution now. Things have also gotten easier with implementing things like incremental static regeneration for partially sort of server-side, non-server-side based sites as well. Most vendors now support this, which is good. When you look at things like ACF being usable via WP GraphQL and no vendor-specific solutions, it's all generally usable and flexible. Headless WordPress has come a long way in the last couple of years to be a real competitor with a lot of the mainline sort of other CMSs out there like Contentful and Sounding, like I mentioned before, which are your general sort of comparators when you're looking at headless CMSs. So if we look at an example, sort of in this case, how Headless WordPress works, if we take a server-based application, so some data that we want to render and query is on our backend. We will choose our front end. In this case, we'll say Next.js, just because that's the hotness right now. We will then take your front end and we'll query that data from the back end. And if you use a GraphQL query, it's a read request essentially. Or if we use a mutation, it's a post request. So if we look at grabbing that information, we will find it and snag it and then send it back. The server then sends that data back to our front end, regardless of the size or whatever it is. That request will then get returned to our front end and then rendered in a custom component. Sort of the Lego that I mentioned before, you would build out a component to sort of render that data and how our end user will interact with that data. So if we look at, example like a calendar, we're going to be returning a bunch of dates or booking dates. If you're building a booking form, as people use the form, you're going to be querying availability times and availability dates. And as those dates dry up, you're going to want to be showing folks that, hey, these dates aren't available. Look at other dates, look at other times, and sort of get that on the fly. You can do that with this sort of implementation. So this is sort of a side note, but I want to mention this as a sort of a participation trophy of sorts. React server components are sort of gaining traction, and things like SSG and SSR are sort of going away in lieu of just more advanced and more efficient server-based requests. But you can do this with Headless WordPress as well. So if you look at the front end querying our server, in this case being our WordPress server, you can have your blogs, all of your components and your comments within the page, and then push and store that in your WordPress database, and then query that data and then render it to your front end as you wish. And you can do that either or with server components, without server components, but a lot of modern development techniques can be used with Headless and storing that data in the default database that comes with WordPress, which is pretty cool. So what are the benefits? Why would I want to consider going Headless? And this is that question I get asked a few times a week, to be fair. It's a pretty good sort of inclination of where the direction of the WordPress community is going. We do have to work out our full site editor debate right now, but for those that want to use a powerful CMS that is really well adopted in the community, there are reasons to sort of convert it to go headless. Predominantly, your first one is speed. So if you are looking at converting a bloated e-commerce site, or if you're looking at just wanting to give a performance boost over a site that is formerly slow, or make use of cheaper hardware to be able to achieve faster times. So statically generated websites can be hosted on, say, Vercel's hobby plan, for example, or their $20 a month plan, and achieve a lot, right, versus some walk-in prices for some managed hosting providers is $20, $30, $50 a month. So you can save a little bit of money, and you can have that WordPress server stored on a really cheap $5 DigitalOcean plan, and only really query it as needed. And if your content is just statically generated, meaning you have a longer build time, but you will not really need to call that data all the time. Core Web Vitals really appeals well with headless sites as well, because you're using really fast technology. Using modern developer tools is another big one too. So you're exposing yourself to sort of more modern development tooling. What I mean by this is things like, if you look at how a modern WordPress website is built, you don't necessarily have a dev mode or a test mode or anything like that, like an instant reload or anything like that we're used to in the JavaScript sense side of things. As an example, really bad example, but it's a quick example. You can enable stuff like that, like local gives you a hot reload option, but the sort of things that we've expect, when I change a line of code and I press enter and save, I want to be able to see what that looks like on my screen. You don't necessarily get that straight away with that live reload with WordPress. You can use modern CI/CD development pipeline, which is handy if you are adopting or migrating into different CI/CD sort of environments and testing and the like, and implementing different testing approaches and different methods of constructing more advanced sites as well. So one of the benefits of Headless just being away from the language complexity and having to learn new languages, you can expose yourself to different platforms as well too. So if you look at things like VR, if you look at the mobile as well, if you look at anything else that essentially that can run a JavaScript page, you can really run your front end on and then query that data. So it's less about what WordPress can do, and it's more about what your front end can do and run on. So that's where the developer tooling comes in. It sort of broadens your spectrum and your horizon to what you can build and where you can run it, versus locking yourself down to, I'm familiar with WordPress development and I'm familiar with JavaScript development. It doesn't really overlap that much, or it does. What's the difference? Yeah, it does. It does overlap, and a lot of it's very similar. But if we look at what you can power with these front ends versus WordPress, then you are then suddenly able to expose yourself to a lot more avenues and potentially a lot more clients too. So this is sort of playing off that last point, but platform expansion. So faster e-commerce is a really great example of things like why you would use Headless WordPress. But VR, mobile as well are just also great examples of this. So a good example to how to pivot would be using your WordPress backend to have data stores for an e-commerce side of things, and then you have a mobile app that can render your shop as well to end users, and your front end as well on the web. So you can use React Native for web with Expo to run the web component, and then React Native does the rest, and then can query that data as it needs to render that data live to the end user on your mobile phone, which is pretty cool. VR as well. Again, shout out to Expo. There are some VR-based platforms as well out there, but you can expose AR, VR platforms with JavaScript-based technologies that can just query, again, WordPress if required, if you want to render that data. But then modern sort of approaches that don't involve such advanced techniques, things like just making the web faster. So again, faster e-commerce, faster end user checkouts, faster end user experiences on the web, which is powerful, but still using a viable and frankly well trusted CMS that everyone can use on the back end, rather than having something that's overly complex and overly complicated. So what were some use cases for Headless WordPress be? Another good question that I sort of ask and I work on myself in terms of looking at proof of concepts and building out sort of micro apps and just base little proof of concepts for either my clients or my main job as well. And we look at how can folks make use of this technology other than the speed conversation, or other than, hey, this makes this faster and all this sort of things. It is very flexible and viable technology. And there are some interesting case studies out there from vendors like WP Engine, Kinstar, and WordPress VIP as well for why would you make Headless WordPress and who uses it. Pantheon as well do a headless sort of WordPress sort of technique. But if you look at someone like Android Authority too, they converted a couple of years ago to Headless WordPress, and they now see nearly 6 times build performance and site performance for a massive news website, which is pretty impressive. For a vendor such as them, who gets hundreds of thousands of hits a month, that's impressive, to say the least, and something that would be, not impossible to achieve on WordPress, but there might be some performance constraints there. So first, I mentioned this before, but faster e-commerce is kind of a key. Oh, look, I didn't move my lorem ipsum on my slide. Well, there we go, rookie error. But faster e-commerce is a pretty important one that I mentioned. I work a lot with e-commerce customers from day to day. And if you are looking at how to make that end user experience faster, so checkouts, product loads, product content, all that sort of stuff work faster, then Headless is a great route for that. One thing that people don't necessarily think of, but can be possible as well too with Headless, if you're using WordPress as a data store, again, you can expose your backend to other front-end CMSs, to things like Shopify, Magento. You can use their data and have their inventory and their shop-based stuff on your front end too. So you can actually use multiple commerce vendors. Not necessarily a common thing, to say the least, but definitely something to check out. Bloated websites. This is what I mentioned before, but a really good use case for Headless is to take the core platform of WordPress and a core site for an end customer. Let's say, a booking website, again, as an example, just off the top of my head. And if you want to make that site faster, let's make the end user experience more appealing. Let's make, some modern technology. It's, speed things up a little bit, get away from maybe a theme that you don't want to use anymore. These are great candidates for Headless WordPress. LMSs as well, or anything that handles membership users, logged in data, or prolonged logged in users with WordPress is great for Headless too, since when you do log into a website in monolithic or traditional, WordPress, a logged in user is a dynamic user. So any behavior that they use as they log in can't get cached. So if you want to be able to remove that load off the back end and just remove that load to a front end and then have that data queryable by an API or however you want to run it, Headless WordPress makes that a lot easier and a lot more viable to make things flexible when it comes to, hey, I want to do XYZ with my membership user portal and I want to introduce all these new features, and you're going to have to do 20,000 plugins and bog down the site, and it's just going to make things slower. Well, if you hard code that, or if you do it in a different way with Headless WordPress, you can achieve that end function. Java, and this is for the flip side, the other side of the fence, JavaScript devs using a trusted CMS. So Yes, WordPress powers a significant chunk of the web, but when we look at what is outside of that sphere, there is a variety of other technologies at play, and some WordPress devs maybe don't expose themselves to that. They just work predominantly with WordPress and call it a day. Other developers do, and they maybe are interested in looking at implementing that technology somehow, or just trying to play with different languages, different tools, and want to see how that fits with WordPress. So a trusted CMS like WordPress is a great tool to sort of implement into your arsenal as a JavaScript developer. If you are looking at a reliable, powerful, and scalable CMS to store data, use custom post types, and just be flexible with, WordPress is a great candidate for that and works really simply in a lot of ways, similar to Contentful and Sanity. If you expand it with advanced custom fields, the custom post types UI, things like that, to really make your life sort of easier and really drill down into what the platform is capable of. So what are some challenges of Headless WordPress? Frankly, when the fly on the wall with this is, why would I use this? Why are people watching and they want to say, hey, what do I want to do with Headless WordPress? What I want to pivot? It's a lot of work. It's expensive. Pricing for vendors is all enterprise pricing. Why would I use this technology? And that's a fair comment. In a lot of cases, a lot of platforms out there aren't necessarily reflecting the true pricing of what you can do with the platform, and that is a sort of a hurdle in itself. If unless you're really interested, you want to drill down into how to make this work on something like a $20 Vercel Pro plan and a $10, to a $15 TD plan from Flywheel, you can make that all work. It just requires some effort. You don't have to go an all-in-one siloed solution from someone like Pantheon or whomever. You can just pick two separate distributors, so Netlify and WP Engine as an example, or Vercel and Flywheel, or GoDaddy and Railway as an example, and you can go ahead and do it yourself. But that does involve some hurdles like new languages. So if you are not familiar with the front-end frameworks outside of WordPress, then you will have to learn them. React is what I generally recommend because it is the big player, but it does have some cross-skilling. Like I mentioned, if you learn React in the current versioning, you will be able to take those skills and re-implement them into things like WordPress plugins in the current day as well, and content blocks. It does require developers too. So in the past, you might have been able to get away with not having a developer on the team, or not necessarily needing a developer. You can use a page builder like Elementor, build out a website and call it a day. If you do want to go headless, you will need a developer. There's also framework specificity. I wanted to mention this more from a sort of platform side rather than just a general use case side. But when you look at someone like Vercel and Next.js, since they make the framework, incremental static regeneration, or ISR, was a big thing that was hard to implement outside of Vercel for quite a while. A few vendors now, like WP Engine and Railway, have been able to achieve this mostly on their end. WP Engine specifically have been able to achieve implementing this technology for front ends, so you can change up your rendering methodology. For a while, you could not really use it outside of Vercel, which was a bit of a pain, especially if you're used to it or like to be on the bleeding edge and you can't really transport your app around. Now you can, which is great. But new auth methods as well. There are things you can do with JWT and GraphQL to kind of roll your own authentication with WordPress, which is pretty cool. Certain frameworks as well, like Fast.js, also have authentication baked in, or easier to use authentication implemented. But more modern sort of auth methods outside of WordPress, as long as they can query WordPress, can be used. But in some cases, you might have to roll your own in some cases, which is not necessarily going to be very user intuitive to start with. You will have to figure it out and build it. There are going to be some hurdles in building out a blueprint, a theme, a framework to start with, regardless of the project. If you're an agency, I generally recommend a theme or a blueprint of your own that gets you about 75% of the way there. And then the remaining 25% you achieve with that bespoke functionality that you would work with for an end customer. Like you build your theme for, and then it can be used as a WordPress site a WooCommerce site. So you can use it to build a marketplace, or you use it to build a forum or anything else like that. And you repeat and iterate on it further down the line. It's called composable sort of architecture. And you can build out that library of components and then make your work easier and easier and easier later down the line as you grow, which is the end result and the ideal result. But in the initial stage, it will be complex to shift around, and that should be noted, especially if you are looking at developer hours and pitching for budgets and these kinds of things. It will take time. Right, lastly a little bit, tools and technologies. What sort of tools are we looking at when it comes to pivoting to Headless WordPress? Pretty simple in a lot of cases. The GraphQL is the big one via the WP GraphQL plugin or the REST API. You need something to handle your content. You need something to query with content. That is generally your handled by GraphQL or the REST API. You will find if you are converting into a theme or converting from something that's really or is an existing project and not new, you might refer to the REST API to start with, and a lot of the sort of older sort of WordPress devs in the room might prefer the REST API to start with and just lower that sort of learning ceiling. I myself, I prefer either. I'm not the best with GraphQL, but I get by. But I do prefer the REST API in a lot of cases, but I know GraphQL is better for just the data structure and the size of the amount you can query. Advanced custom fields as well, to make things easier for folks and make the backend more flexible and more expandable. ACF has been for a while now been able to be used with both the REST API but also GraphQL. So if you are, again, converting sites or want to expand on sites and need more custom post types and custom sort of parts within the site, you can use ACF Pro and the CPT UI to sort of create those custom fields and use them and implement them. For example, like an ACF gallery or a calendar or anything like that, if you want to supersede something like the events calendar or a maybe Enviro gallery as an example. The JavaScript framework of choice. You will need a JavaScript framework. You'll need something that runs on Node.js. You can use, again, like I said before, Astro. You can use Next.js, anything you like. As long as it is viable to run on Node, it will run and be able to query in most cases. So vendors like WP Engine, Pantheon, VIP will sell you a server that runs both the Node.js side and then runs the backend for the WordPress side. So as long as you can run on Node.js, you can run it on one of these hosting providers. Again, Netlify, Vercel, Railway, they will just run the front end. You will have to find a backend provider, so someone who runs WordPress. But if you are looking at just a cheap solution, someone like SiteGround as well is good for just the backend, and then you can just point your front end to the SiteGround test domain and then go from there. Quite straightforward. An auth method of choice. So if you are handling authentication, frankly, I would recommend figuring out how you want to handle something complex like auth, depending on your application. I've personally sort of landed on the Fast.js method, but NextAuth as well is out there too, as well as the GraphQL and JWT approach as well. But that would just be a personal recommendation from projects I've done, as well as some of the clients I've worked with. Kind of get that sorted out pretty early on. It can be a bit of a hurdle later down the line, depending on how dense your theme is and how much you've invested in certain ways you've built that theme. But that's about it. It's a bit of a primer for Headless. I thank you for your time. I'm going to be putting up some tutorials in the future on how to sort of get started with it as well, what the back end looks like, what the plugins you need, what the front end looks like, and sort of building out that headless sort of stuff. This is my job, so to speak, with what I do, my main line of work, and something I'm very passionate about and I'm sort of evangelical about when it comes to helping WordPress developers do cool stuff. So love WordPress, love the community, and love Headless. So happy to sort of marry the two together. Got any questions as well, hit me up. I am samtoohey on Twitter and Threads, on my website below, samtoohey.xyz. Thank you very much. Take care. Have a great day.